when the promise returned from the invoke payment or pre-auth call is resolved, a JudoPay receipt object is returned. Even if the request has a status response of 200, it does not necessarily mean that the result of the transaction was successful. You will need to look at the receipt object's result field to see the transaction result. This example shows a frictionless issuer reject scenario, which is one of the negative scenarios where 3D Secure 2 authorization is rejected. Alternatively, when the promise is rejected, an error object is returned. This means the transaction did not go through successfully. The Testing Your Integration documentation also contains examples of the response object returned when the transaction request is successful and the promise is fulfilled. The response object contains information around the transaction, and importantly the result of the transaction, which can be, for example, success, error, or declined. You should handle the transaction result using the information in this object, and also display back to the consumer the result of the transaction. Typically, you may want to redirect to an outcome screen, where the result of the transaction is displayed to the consumer, along with information such as the amount and receipt ID. Here, we are destructuring the response object to extract the properties that we recommend you present to the consumer. Depending on the result of the transaction, we redirect to the relevant result page. In this example, we pass the properties as URL parameters, so they can be rendered on the result page. However, you may handle the response object in any way you wish. As this is a client-side operation, it is highly recommended you also use server-to-server calls in order to validate the success or failure of the transaction. For example, you can share the receipt ID received on your client side with your server side. Your server side can then call the JudoPay transaction API endpoint using the receipt ID. The JudoPay transaction API will return the JudoPay receipt object of the transaction related to this receipt ID. You can then compare this object with the one received on your client side to validate the transaction. For more information on the calls you can make to JudoPay's transaction API, see our API reference documentation. When the promise is rejected, the error response object returned from the transaction function can come in two different forms. There are the error responses, passed on from our transaction API. And there are errors thrown by the Web SDK code. You will want to ensure you handle both types of errors. Here are some examples of the error objects thrown by the Web SDK code. They can be caused by providing incorrect values, the consumer canceling a transaction, and timeouts. Here are some examples of the errors that originate from our transaction API. The Web SDK reformats the error and passes it back to you. These errors are caused by the transaction itself, for example, incorrect payment credentials, or failure of 3D Secure 2. For more information on the error responses returned, see the Web SDK Error Responses section in the developer documentation. Here, it describes the two error types that are returned from Web SDK functions, along with a more detailed description of the format of the API errors.